What if the French Revolution had never broken out? Just imagine. No guillotines buzzing like a creepy alarm clock, no cries of liberty or death, and most importantly, no Napoleon running around Europe like a middle manager who got an unlimited corporate budget. Does it sound like a boring historical series where everyone just drinks tea and complains about the weather? Or maybe it's a chance for the world to turn around in a completely different way, without chaos, but also without the changes that we consider the norm today? Here's a paradox. The revolution that took thousands of lives and turned everything upside down could have been not only a disaster, but also an engine without which we would be stuck in corsets and wigs to this day. Intrigued? Then sit back, grab a coffee, and let's dive into a story that never happened, but could have changed everything. Why is it interesting? Because the French Revolution is not just a couple of pages in a textbook, but a moment when humanity said, "No more suffering," and immediately added, "But let's tear each other apart a little more to make sure we remember it." Without her, the world could be calmer, or, on the contrary, mired in a swamp of outdated kings and boring banquets, where the main entertainment would be listening to Louis XVI complain about another bad harvest. We will try to figure out what would have happened if the revolutionaries had simply shrugged their shoulders and gone home, leaving the king on the throne. And believe me, it wouldn't be just a case of, well, I guess we would have lived as before. There is an alternative history ahead, full of unexpected twists and turns, light irony, how can you do without it when it comes to the French, and thoughts that you won't be able to put down for a long time. So hold on, we're about to start. So, let's imagine that the year 1789 in France passed without much noise. Louis XVI, instead of trembling from the pitchfork-wielding crowd, sits peacefully on his throne, sipping wine and muttering something about how hard it is to be king when peasants complain about taxes again. Marie Antoinette, by the way, does not say her famous "no bread, eat cakes," not because she has suddenly become wise, but because no one asks. The revolution did not happen. So what's next? Let's figure out where this alternative history would have gone, and believe me, it would not have become less interesting without the guillotines. The first thing that catches your eye is the fate of the French monarchy. Without the revolution, Louis XVI might have lived to see his gray hairs, although he would hardly have become a popular favorite. 18th century France was on the verge of bankruptcy. Wars, a luxurious court, and unsuccessful attempts at reform sucked the treasury dry. Without a radical breakdown, the king would probably have tried to patch things up. Say he would have invited a few smart people like Necker to figure out how to collect more taxes without causing a revolt. But knowing Louis, who loved to hunt more than to rule, it would have ended in another, "Well, we'll try next year." France would have been slowly sliding into an economic pit, but without any sudden moves. The irony is that the peasants who were actually chopping off heads would have been grumbling to themselves, "If only the king would go to the field for once, not just to the balls." And what about Europe? Without the revolution, there would have been no Napoleon, who in real history dispersed this chaos to a pan-European level. Imagine, no Napoleonic wars, no "I'm the emperor, so let's take everything to Moscow." Russia, by the way, could have exhaled. Alexander I would not have had to burn his own capital to prove to the French that winter in Russia is not for the weak. But Napoleon's absence would have had disadvantages. Without his reforms in the Napoleonic Code, Europe would have held on to the old feudal laws longer. In France, the aristocracy would have continued to live in its bubble world, where the main problem would have been to choose which shade of silk would match the new carriage. Meanwhile, Britain, which in reality feared revolutionary ideas like the plague, would have been quietly drinking tea and building up its empire without being distracted by French dramas. Technology and culture are where the fun begins. The French Revolution gave impetus to the ideas of the Enlightenment: freedom, equality, brotherhood, and a few guillotines for those who didn't understand. Without it, Europe might have remained in the shadow of absolutism for longer. The Industrial Revolution, which was really gaining momentum in Britain, would have been slowed down on the continent. Kings and aristocrats would not have been in a hurry to invest in steam engines if the old mills were still turning. In France, instead of factories, we could have seen more exquisite palaces. Marie Antoinette would have ordered a couple more Versailles to have a place to hold balls. And science? Without the revolutionary chaos that forced Europe to adapt, we might have delayed the emergence of many inventions. Imagine, the 19th century, and the French still write letters with goose quills and complain that postal pigeons are lazy. But the funniest thing is people. Without the revolution, there would have been no explosion of ideas that changed society. Instead of shouting for rights, French peasants would have been quietly working in the fields, and aristocrats would have been telling each other how hard it was to find a good tailor. Louis, by the way, could have become a hero of jokes. Did you hear the king raise taxes again? He says he needs a new collection of hunting dogs. In Europe, monarchies would have held on stronger, but would have slowly rotted from the inside, because without the revolutionary kick reforms would have gone at a snail's pace. It is ironic that without the French Revolution, we might still be arguing whether to give the common people the right to vote or to leave it to the educated gentleman. And what about religion? Without the revolution, the Catholic Church in France would not have lost its power as dramatically as it did in reality. In our alternate history, bishops and abbots would have continued to sit in luxurious mansions, preaching about humility while peasants gave their last tithes. Louis XVI, who did not mind appearing pious himself, might even organize a couple of loud religious festivals to distract the people from thoughts of famine. Imagine a parade in honor of some saint, with the king proudly waving from the balcony and the crowd whispering, "We would rather have bread than these candles of yours." The church would remain a brake on progress, but also a stable pillar of the monarchy, at least until someone started asking uncomfortable questions. Another turn was in art and literature. Without the revolutionary spirit that inspired romantics like Hugo or artists who painted heroic rebellions, French culture might have remained captive to lavish odes and portraits of aristocrats. Instead of Les Miserables, we would have read something like Diary of a Court Footman, a boring chronicle of how difficult it is to choose the right sauce for a royal dinner, and Beethoven, who in reality dedicated his heroic symphony to Napoleon and then became disillusioned, would probably have written a waltz for another ball in Versailles. The culture would have become elegant but sleepy without the fire that the revolution ignited. Now think about the present. Without revolutionary ideas, there would have been no American Constitution in its current form, because the United States was inspired by France, nor the wave of decolonization in the 20th century. Empires like the British or Russian might have lasted longer, and democracy would have remained an exotic idea for a narrow circle of dreamers. France, on the other hand, might have become just a picturesque country where the main pride would have been croissants and wine, not slogans about freedom. But isn't it funny to imagine a world where, instead of the anthem Marseillaise, the French sing something about how beautiful this palace is, pay your taxes on time. This is an alternative history, calm, a little boring, but with a touch of what if. So, where have we come to in this alternative history without the French Revolution? A world where Louis XVI lives to a ripe old age muttering about taxes, Marie Antoinette orders another palace, and Napoleon remains an unknown officer complaining about boredom in the garrison. Europe is slowly creeping forward, but without the explosion that made everyone wake up and say, maybe we should stop living like in the Middle Ages. Monarchies lasted longer, democracy was late, and we might still be wearing wigs and considering croissants the pinnacle of progress. The irony is that without this chaos, we might have avoided wars and guillotines, but we would have been stuck in a world where the main question of the day would have been, will there be enough wine for the feast? This story makes you wonder, what if one small twist changed everything? The real world as we know it is as fragile as the glass in Marie Antoinette's hands, and sometimes one careless move could lead us down a completely different path. Maybe we don't notice it, but those high-profile revolutions that shook the thrones gave us not only freedom, but also a chance to choose, at least between coffee and tea, and not between pay dutifully or rebel. Imagine yourself in this alternative world, sitting in a coffee shop and the waiter asks, would you like your wine before or after taxes? And you laugh because there are simply no other problems in this peaceful life. So if you enjoyed thinking about these what-ifs, please like us. It's a sign that we're on the same page. And subscribe because there are many more stories to come. Let's figure out together how history would have turned out and laugh at how funny our ancestors could have been without all these revolutionary dramas. See you in the next story. Keep your coffee ready.